Hey, everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into something pretty cool today. It's a book called Magic Words by Jonah Berger.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, have you read it?
I have. It's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, so we thought this would be a perfect one to kind of dig into and see what we can learn from it.
Absolutely.
So Jonah Berger, he's a marketing professor at Wharton, and he's also a best-selling author. And in this book, he explores the idea that certain words hold a kind of hidden power.
Mm.
They can influence how we think, how we feel, and even how we make decisions.
It's amazing how much power language has, right? Like, we
Yeah.
use it every single day, but we rarely stop to think about the subtle ways it's shaping our reality.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, have you ever noticed how a single word or phrase can completely change the tone of a conversation?
Oh, absolutely. Like, just think about the difference between saying something like, that's interesting, versus, that's a bad idea.
Yeah, or even just a simple word like but, you know?
Oh, yeah, but can be a real conversation killer sometimes, right?
Yeah, it can totally shift the direction of a conversation.
Hmm.
So in Magic Words, Berger breaks down some pretty compelling research and real-world examples to illustrate how these magic words work.
Yeah, and he does a great job making it accessible to everyone, right? Like, you don't need a PhD in psychology to understand the concepts.
Yeah, exactly. So what really stood out to you from the beginning of the book? Like, what kind of hooked you in?
Right from the start, Berger dives into this idea that magic words are distinct from everyday language. It's not just about using fancy vocabulary or being a smooth talker.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the psychological mechanisms that make certain words so effective.
So it's like these words have a kind of hidden code that our brains respond to.
Exactly, like they tap into our subconscious desires, our fears, our biases.
So they're almost like a secret language that we're not even aware of?
Yeah, and that's what makes them so powerful.
Yeah.
Because they can influence us without us even realizing it.
Can you give us an example of this in action?
Oh, sure. One of the most striking examples that Berger uses is the power of the word because.
Oh, because.
Yeah, it sounds so simple, right?
Yeah.
But research has shown that simply adding because to a request, even if the reason you give is completely trivial,
Yeah.
can dramatically increase the likelihood of people complying.
Yeah.
It's like our brains are hardwired to look for justifications, and even a weak one can be surprisingly persuasive.
So it's not so much about the actual reason itself, but just the fact that there is a reason.
Yeah, exactly. It's like our brains just need that little bit of logic to feel comfortable saying yes.
So instead of just asking, can I borrow your pen, adding, can I borrow your pen because I need to sign something,
Right.
could actually make a big difference.
Huge difference. And it's something you can test out yourself, Try it out in your everyday life and see what happens.
That's fascinating. So it's like understanding these magic words could give us an edge in everyday conversations.
Absolutely. It's like having a secret weapon in your communication
I
arsenal.
like that. A secret weapon. But I'm also curious about how we actually go about crafting persuasive messages using these principles.
Yeah.
It's one thing to understand how they work, but how do we actually put them into practice?
Well, that's where Berger gets into some really practical techniques. In the next chapter, he talks about the importance of specificity and concreteness in language.
Right.
Vague statements simply don't have the same persuasive power as those that paint a clear picture in the listener's mind.
Right. It's like, this product will change your life versus this product will help you reduce stress by 30% within a week.
Exactly. The second statement is much more compelling because it gives you a specific, tangible benefit, something you can visualize and connect with.
So concrete details are key.
Absolutely. They make your words more believable, more impactful.
And what other techniques does Berger highlight for crafting those impactful messages?
Well, he also talks about the strategic use of questions, particularly rhetorical questions.
Okay.
These can be incredibly effective for leading people to a specific conclusion without being overtly forceful.
So instead of directly stating your point, you pose a question that prompts the listener to arrive at that conclusion on their own.
Exactly. It's like you're guiding their thought process in a subtle way.
It's almost like planting a seed in their mind.
Right. And because they feel like they've come to the conclusion themselves, they're much more likely to believe it.
That's really interesting. It's like we all want to feel like we're in control of our own thoughts and decisions.
Exactly. And rhetorical questions allow us to do that while still being subtly influenced.
It's like a win-win.
Yeah.
It is. It is.
This is all starting to sound a bit like mind control. I'm joking, of course. But it is fascinating how subtly language can shape our perceptions.
Oh, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
It's like a form of persuasion that operates below our conscious awareness.
Right, and Berger goes even deeper into this idea with the concept of framing.
Ah, framing, yeah.
Essentially, it's about how the same information presented in different ways can evoke completely different responses.
Absolutely. Like a classic example is how you frame a medical procedure.
You can say it has a 90% success rate or a 10% failure rate.
Right. Same information, but it feels totally different.
Completely different.
Right.
Because our brains are wired to focus on the negative. So that 10% failure rate is going to loom much larger in our mind.
Yeah, even though it's technically the same as a 90% success rate.
Exactly. It's all about how you spin it, how you frame the information.
It's amazing how a simple shift in wording can have such a profound impact on our understanding.
Absolutely. And it shows just how much power language has over our thoughts and decisions.
This is making me think about all the ways I've been unconsciously influenced by language throughout my life.
I think we all have.
And Berger's book really opens your eyes to it. It's like you start to see the matrix.
It really does. And the more aware you become of these techniques, the better equipped you are to navigate the world of communication.
Yeah, it's like having a decoder ring for language.
Exactly. You can start to see through the smoke and mirrors and understand the true meaning behind the words.
I love that. So we've talked about the power of because, the importance of specificity, and the subtle art of framing. What other insights does Berger offer into this world of magic words?
Well, he goes on to explore the incredible power of emotions and how certain words can trigger emotional responses that are even more persuasive than rational arguments.
That's really interesting. You know, we often think of logic and reason as being the driving forces behind our decisions, but it seems that emotions play a much bigger role than we realize.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. We're much more likely to be swayed by a story that makes us feel something than by a dry, logical argument.
That makes sense. So it's not just about what we say, but how we make people feel.
Exactly. And Berger dives deep into how specific words can act like emotional triggers, tapping into our deepest desires and fears.
Wow, that's pretty powerful stuff. So we need to consider not just the content of our words, but also the emotional impact they might have on the listener.
Precisely. Think about a marketing campaign that uses heart-wrenching storytelling to connect with its audience. That can be incredibly effective, even if the product itself isn't particularly groundbreaking.
I see what you mean. People buy into the emotion, not just the product. So storytelling and emotions are key.
They are, but Berger cautions that there's a fine line to walk. Too much emotional appeal can backfire and come across as manipulative. It's all about finding that sweet spot where you're genuinely connecting with people on an emotional level without being exploitative.
This is all really making me think about how I use language in my own life. It's fascinating how many layers there are to communication.
It truly is. And we've only just begun to scratch the surface. Berger delves even deeper into the psychology of words, exploring how our brains process and interpret language.
This is where things get a bit more technical, right? I'm curious to learn about these cognitive processes and how they relate to magic words. Tell me more.
It is fascinating how our brains process language.
Yeah.
Berger talks about how our brains are constantly bombarded with information, so we develop these mental shortcuts to process things quickly.
Makes sense. Our brains would be totally overwhelmed otherwise.
Exactly. And these shortcuts are really useful in a lot of cases. But they can also lead to some interesting biases in how we interpret information.
Oh, like what?
Well, one example that Berger talks about is confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias. I've heard of that. But can you remind me what it is?
Sure, it's basically the tendency to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Oh, yeah. I definitely do that sometimes.
We all do. It's a natural human tendency. You
Yeah.
know, we tend to seek out information that supports our worldview, and we kind of ignore or downplay information that contradicts it.
Right. Like, if I believe that climate change is a hoax, I'm probably going to spend more time reading articles that support that view than articles that challenge it.
Exactly. And this is where magic words come into play, because if someone uses language that aligns with our existing beliefs, we're more likely to be persuaded by them, even if their arguments aren't logically sound.
That's kind of scary, actually. It means we're all vulnerable to manipulation if we're not careful.
That's true. But awareness is the first step. By understanding these cognitive biases, we can start to be more critical of the information we consume.
So it's not just about using magic words to persuade others, but also about recognizing them when they're used on us.
Exactly. It's about becoming more media literate, more discerning consumers of information.
I like that. So we've talked about the individual psychology of words, but Berger also goes beyond that to look at how language shapes our social interactions.
Right, he dedicates a couple of chapters to this, really emphasizing the importance of building connections through language.
Yeah, language is how we connect with each other, how we build relationships.
Exactly. And Berger talks about how certain words can create a sense of unity and belonging, while others can create division and conflict.
Like what kind of words?
Well, think about the difference between saying we and us versus you and them.
Oh, yeah. That's subtle, but it makes a big difference.
Right, we and us create a sense of shared identity, while you and them create a sense of separation.
So it's about choosing words that foster inclusion rather than exclusion.
Exactly. And it's not just about big pronouncements. It can be as simple as saying, I understand how you feel, or that must have been difficult for you.
Those are powerful phrases. They convey empathy and understanding.
Exactly. And they can really strengthen relationships.
So it's not just about the words themselves, but also the intention behind them.
Absolutely. And speaking of intention, Berger also talks about the importance of audience adaptation.
Audience adaptation, what does that mean?
It basically means tailoring your communication to the specific audience you're trying to reach.
So you wouldn't use the same language when talking to a group of teenagers as you would when talking to a group of senior citizens.
Exactly. You need to understand their demographics, their interests, their values, and use language that resonates with them.
That makes sense. You wouldn't use a lot of slang when talking to your grandma.
Probably not unless your grandma's super cool.
Maybe. So it's not just about choosing the right words, but also about using them in the right context.
Exactly. Context is everything.
So how do we actually go about adapting our communication to different audiences? Is there a formula for that?
Well, it's not a formula exactly, but Berger provides some really helpful guidelines. He talks about the importance of understanding your audience's emotional state, their level of knowledge on the topic, and even their personality type.
So it's like you need to do your research before you open your mouth.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
You need to know who you're talking to and what they care about.
That seems like a lot of work.
It can be, but it's worth it. Because when you take the time to understand your audience, your communication will be much more effective.
So it's all about being intentional with our words.
Exactly. And ultimately, Berger argues that mastering magic words isn't about manipulation or trickery. It's about using language to connect with people authentically and create positive change.
That's a refreshing perspective. I was starting to get a little worried that this was all about learning how to manipulate people.
Not at all. In fact, Berger is very clear about the ethical dimension of language. He stresses that we have a responsibility to use our words for good.
So it's not just about getting what we want, but about making a positive impact on the world.
Exactly. And that brings us to Berger's final chapter, where he talks about transformative communication.
Transformative communication. What's that?
It's essentially about using all these principles we've been talking about to become more effective and impactful communicators.
So it's about taking all these magic words and using them to create real change in the world.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond simple information transfer and really connecting with people on a deeper level.
I like that. So how does Berger define transformative communication? What does it look like in practice?
He describes it as the ability to inspire, motivate, and create meaningful change. It's about using language to make a real difference in the world, both for ourselves and for others.
So it's not just about talking the talk, but also walking the walk.
Exactly. And he believes that this is something we can all learn to do with practice and intention.
That's encouraging. I'm starting to see how these seemingly simple magic words can actually be quite powerful.
They can be. It's all about understanding how to use them effectively.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive into the world of magic words. But before we wrap things up, is there anything else that you'd like to highlight from the book? Any final takeaways that really stood out to you?
You know, one of the things that really stood out to me was Berger's emphasis on the ethical use of language.
Yeah.
Like, it's not about manipulating people or using these techniques for some kind of personal gain.
Yeah,
It's about understanding how to communicate more effectively and responsibly.
it's like with any kind of power,
Hmm.
you know? It can be used for good or for evil.
Exactly. And Berger is very clear that he wants people to use these magic words for good, to build people up, not tear them down.
So how could we do that? Like, what are some practical ways to use magic words ethically?
Well, one example that Berger talks about is using affirming and empathetic language in relationships.
Yeah.
You know, like instead of offering unsolicited advice when a friend is going through a tough time,
Yeah.
just saying something like, I'm here for you, or
Ah,
I can only imagine how hard this must be.
yeah.
Those simple phrases can be incredibly powerful
Mm-hmm.
because they convey empathy and support without trying to fix the problem.
Yeah, it's like you're just acknowledging their feelings and letting them know that you care.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's all people need.
This whole conversation has really made me think about my own communication style.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I realize that I often focus on getting my point across,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I don't always stop to think about how my words might be affecting the other person.
That's something we all need to be mindful of.
Yeah. And Berger's book really highlights the importance of perspective taking,
Right.
trying to see things from the other person's point of view.
Absolutely. And that's where audience adaptation comes in, like we were talking about earlier.
Right. So it's not just about choosing the right words, but also about understanding the context in which those words are being used.
Exactly. And being sensitive to the needs of your audience.
So for our listeners who are eager to put these magic words into practice, what are some key takeaways that you would recommend they focus on?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be mindful of the words you use.
Yeah.
Think about the impact your words might have on others. Are you building people up or tearing them down? Are you creating connections or reinforcing divisions?
It's like that old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me.
Right.
But that's totally not true. Words can be incredibly hurtful.
Absolutely. They can leave scars that last a lifetime.
So we need to use our words carefully and intentionally.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment, Try out different magic words in different situations and see what works best for you.
It's all about finding your own authentic voice and using it to communicate in a way that is both effective and meaningful.
Well said. And remember, this is just the beginning of the journey. There's always more to learn about the power of language.
That's for sure.
Yeah,
I know I'll be paying much closer attention to the words I use from now on.
me too. And I encourage all of our listeners to do the same.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive into magic words. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, we encourage you to pick up a copy of Magic Words by Jonah Berger and explore these concepts further. It's a book that will really change the way you think about language and its power. Until next time, keep diving deep.